Today I'm going to talk you through Parker painting a 1/4 scale Jinx statue designed by Bulkmancer. In this model she is holding her Rhinogun, which is so huge and with a lot of its own detail and complexity it was really treated as if it was a second model. Since it's been such a popular character this year, a lot of people have painted it, however they have mostly taken the true metallic metal route, and I can't say I blame them because, as you're about to find out, to stick to that Arcane style and paint the whole model non-metallic metal is an awful lot of work, so we better get to it. So Parker really enjoys colour mixing, for which these golden so flat paints are perfect. We plan to dive a bit more into why he uses these artist paints in a more specific and detailed video, but what's important to know when watching this video is that you don't have to go out and buy all the paints I'm going to list to try and replicate this process. Whenever Parker creates a mix in this video, aim to colour match to his final mix colour with whatever you have in your existing collection. Parker started on the shark head, which is 2 different types of metal for each half of the jaw. He started with this dark grey half first. He initially mixed the colour on his wet palette using cadmium orange and ultramarine blue, with some titanium white ready to adjust the shade. However, he first wanted to base coat with the airbrush and ran into a problem as cadmium orange shouldn't go through the airbrush. If you're in Canada, for example, you've probably seen all the scary warnings when you go to buy cadmium based colours. So he turned to some Liquitex inks to help achieve the colour in the airbrush. This ended up being a mix of acrylic medium, ultramarine blue, vivid red orange Liquitex ink, cadmium yellow Liquitex ink, and titanium white. His next steps are to alternate between dry brushing to bring out the edge highlights and using the airbrush to darken some of the shadows and apply a general top coat coverage. These are all important steps to cycle between to eventually hit that aged metal look we're going for. Next, Park uses his brush to paint Payne's grey into the scratch detailing sculpted outwards from the teeth. He mixes up some more of this grey in the dish, ready to use with his sponge. If you've caught any previous videos, you'll know that these beauty blenders are a vital tool in his toolbox. He uses this to put some texture into the piece, and you can see here how the edge is lightened with this really soft gradient. A lot of this model alternates between brush painting, airbrushing and sponge work, continuing until desired effect is achieved. The eyes on her launcher are glowing, so he first paints in the base colour using phthalo green blue, diluted with acrylic medium to paint in the frame of the eyes. Parker then uses white ink through the airbrush to start the initial build-up of light. Then he goes back over the eye frame again with phthalo green blue to strengthen the colour. He switches back to airbrush, but this time using diluted phthalo green blue to start making the glow the correct colour. And he uses the brush one more time to get a solid phthalo green frame. Next we're moving on to some bronze sections, first starting with this circular part. He lays out burnt umber, burnt sienna and Mars yellow deep on his wet palette and lays the first layer with his sponge. He switches over to his airbrush using sepia and raw umber ink to achieve this aged bronze look. To paint in the highlights, Parker uses the existing bronze mix on his wet palette mixed with some Titan buff with his brush. An important part of NMM is high contrast, so these upper edge highlights are very light in comparison. Next, the teeth need to go through the same bronze stages, so we're going to focus on just one here. Again, alternating his tools using all the same colours that we just covered. In the scene this model is based on, Jinx is covered in fluorescent paint markings all over both her and her Rhinogun. So Parker starts to freehand in some of these markings using a mix of fluorescent pink and white for the pink, and cobalt blue for the blue markings. Now we have some more bronze parts, as this half of the shark jaw is completely the aged bronze colour. He uses the same mix of burnt umber, burnt sienna and Mars yellow deep, and first starts off sponging on the colour overall, giving some variation across the jaw. Next, he uses the brush to block in the mixed colour in some of the areas that's harder to reach with the sponge. He goes in with the sponge again, this time using some lighter shades of the mix to dab in some highlights. You may notice he's using the bigger end of this large sponge for when he's more blocking in colour or trying to achieve some texture, and switches to the smaller end for the highlight placement. He then starts to paint in some scratches to the metalwork before using the airbrush to start blending all of this together. Using careful control, he applies very light layers of sepia and raw umber ink. He continues switching between his sponge and airbrush, building up layers and texture until he's reached his desired outcome. He also uses some dry brushing to highlight some of the raised textures on this piece. Next, the final highlights are brush painted along the very edges of the raised textures. Now for the bronze, we use the airbrush again to get the darkest section of the model painted in. To finish up this part of the jaw, we now need to do these horns. This follows the same sort of process, first starting with sponge applying his previously created grey. Now might be a good time to let you know that Parker doesn't actually own a grey paint, so he always creates his own, choosing a mix appropriate for the project he is working on. I think this will be a good subtopic to cover in a future video focusing on his paint choices. For these horns, he mixed his grey with a bit of black to get this base colour. He then puts a dark mix through the airbrush using black, and then areas of a lighter grey through the airbrush using a black and white mix. This helps create a contrast to read as a dull warm metal. Since we covered the bronze fairly in depth, we're not going to go over that again, but do hop back to the last chapter for a reminder, as it's just the same process for a couple of these central pieces. However, there are other things to cover on these pieces, such as some lighting effects. To achieve the glow around here, he alternates between green and white until he achieves the effect he's looking for. He first starts by brush painting Green Ghost dipping ink from Green Stuff World. Next, he switches to the airbrush and applies titanium white ink before switching back to the dipping ink, this time through the airbrush. By the end of the process, he ends up with this glowy look. It's worth remembering that with light, the area closest to the source is brightest, so the centre is near white, and it blends to colour towards the edge. Next on this piece, the pipes are all wrapped with this bandage type material in various places. He first paints in an opaque coverage using Titan Buff with a little bit of brown on his wet palette to adjust the shade. Any brown will be suitable for this job. You can see how this base coat isn't all one uniform colour, leaving darker shades closer to the inside of the pipes to imitate where they would be more shadowed. Next, he further pushes the highlights of the bandages by taking a lighter, near to white mix of the Titan Buff to paint the very edges of the wrap. Then we move on to the saddle. Parker applies this grey colour, which this time he created using a mix of cadmium orange and ultramarine blue in a dish. This is a useful way to keep your painting consistent by avoiding having your main colour diluted by other colours on your wet palette. He does also keep some titanium white on the palette to use alongside this grey mix to adjust as he works on different areas of the saddle and requires slightly different shades. He first applies this mix by brush painting the inner edges of the saddle. Next, he sponges the majority of the surface using the colour created. Sticking with the same previously mixed grey colour, he uses the airbrush to blend the sponge texture and the brush painted edges. Finally, to put some sharp edged highlights into the saddle, he uses the dry brushing technique. This saddle is another area that requires some of the distinctive Jinx markings, so he used light magenta to base coat and fluorescent pink over the top to make the colour pop. The edge of the sponge worked really well to get a straight line that was straight without being too clean and neat, and worked perfectly for the base of these markings. Then he used his size 2 Raphael Kolinsky sable brush to paint in the fluorescent pink. the blue, he used cobalt blue and carefully painted on with the same sized brush. This next segment of her gun also needs to go through the bronze process we covered at the beginning, so we won't cover this again, but I will take the opportunity to talk about this masking putty that we have used for years. Before Parker gets to the airbrushing stages of this bronze section, Parker uses this putty to cover the small sections around the barrel. These will need to remain white as they will soon be painted with a pink glow. We get asked about this putty a lot, so I want to tell you a bit about it. This putty is super easy to apply, it works perfectly to protect covered areas, and when peeled away never takes the paint with it like we've seen some liquid putties do. And the best thing, it is all reusable. Parker has had the same pot for years, and we both use it in our projects and can highly recommend this camouflage putty from AK Interactive. With the sections protected, he is now able to get the pink lights painted in. He first starts by brush painting Quartz Magenta candy ink from Green Stuff World, which is this super bright pink colour. Similarly to the green lights we looked at earlier, he builds up layers switching between near white and the candy pink. This colour he's brush painting next uses titanium white with a small addition of the pink. Next, he airbrushes this mix across the sections to blend together the two brush painted colours. Following this, he turns to magenta Liquitex ink through the airbrush to make the very edges of the light section a stronger pink in comparison to the centre. Now here is one of those moments I feel Parker really goes beyond what a lot of people would, and he starts to consider how the pieces would go together. When noting that the saddle sits above this pink light, he knew he had to make sure the light was appropriately reflected on the underneath of the saddle. This is called object source lighting, with the source being the pink light we have just painted. So he uses candy ink through the airbrush on the underside of the saddle. Where the light disperses more towards the very edges of the saddle, he uses a darker shade with Payne's Grey to blend out the candy ink. Does this show in the final photos? No, but he knows it's there. Moving on to the final section of the gun, you'll see more bronze sections that Parker painted at the same time as the other previous bronze parts. You may notice though that this section has sharper highlights. Because the gun is built with a mix of parts, he noted this section would be more functional, and so he wanted to reflect this by making the metal shinier and newer looking. Now we're ready to move on to some purple. Parker lays out Dioxazine Violet, Payne's Grey and Titan Violet Pale. He starts by brush painting the inside of the tubes where they would be darker and more shadowed by all being close together. The outer parts are instead base coated with the sponge. All the purple parts are blended out with the airbrush using the same mix. Towards these end stages, you can see how alternating the tools has helped to create diffused highlights and varied shadows. Now he has a lovely painted and very big Rhino launcher, he needs to jinxify it a bit more and get her fluorescent paint markings put onto this piece. Most of these are pink, so he used the light magenta and fluorescent pink again. The use of the sponge helps to give them a bit of a roughly applied look. However, he uses the brush to put the fluorescent pink on top and uses some addition of titanium white for the highlights. With this big bulk of the model done, we now need to move on to Jinx herself. Well, I warned you the gun was basically its own model. I expect we're halfway through this video and only just getting to Jinx herself. This outfit, featured in the last act of season 2, has a lot of detail, and again Parker really wanted to make sure he lent into that style of Arcane, so there's a lot of brush painting across this model. To achieve this final look, it's going to take some patience to build up all the shadows and highlights around all of these details. First, we start with her skin. Parker used his go-to mix for painting white skin tones, adjusting to achieve Jinx's particularly pale skin colour. Mixing red violet, burnt sienna and Titan Mars pale, he began the underpainting stage. You'll notice how he adjusts the mix as he paints across the model. This is where his wet palette is really vital, as it allows him to have some variety in shades, with the wet palette keeping them usable throughout this whole stage of painting. He considers shadow and highlight placement carefully, since his next step will involve fine layers to build over the underpainting. He keeps her abs and arm muscles well defined. Moving on to her face, he continues with the same technique, thinking about how her facial expression is going to be reflected in colour differences across the face, whilst also considering additional shadows to get that well-defined arcane look.
They are vast, timeless. They are a mystery, and I am both terrified and reassured to know that there are still...
You'll notice in this finished underpainted face, he also put in some of the scratches she has on her face at this stage too. Next, Parker moves to the airbrush for the top coat of the skin. He mixes the same colours with a higher ratio of Titan Mars pale to get this pale shade. With careful control of the airbrush, he begins to build up in thin layers across the model. You can really see how the underpainting still shows through, given this lovely muscle definition to Jinx. Moving on to the trousers, Parker first base coats with a mix of black and cobalt blue, getting an all-over coverage. Once dry, it gives this light grey colour, and he moves on to painting in all her straps and belts in a mix of raw umber and black, carefully applying with his Raphael size 6 brush. He likes this brush for precise base coating since it's thick, but also holds a nice point to help accurately paint in these straps. With all the base coats down, he uses some titanium white into his existing mix on his wet palette to start building up some lighter shades. First applied with a brush to block in some areas where the straps reflect the light, before using the same mix with his sponge. Similarly to the gun, throughout this process he alternates a lot between brush, sponge and airbrush to achieve these carefully placed layers. You can see how the sponge is really good at highlighting the very edges of the belts and adds in some texture. The sponge particularly helps to apply a grain that more accurately represents the look of worn leather. Alternating between the tools really helps to balance the different effects each gives. Next, he moves on to the airbrush stage to start blending out some of these brush strokes. For the black belts and straps, he uses golden so flat black and carefully applies to blend together all the sponge and brush painted layers, but making sure to not lose those highlights completely. When it came to the main trouser colour, Parker wanted to go for slightly more faded and aged jean look, as the reference image shows the belt standing out as a more solid black in comparison. Therefore, he used black through the airbrush to this time apply much more delicately, allowing these gentle layers to leave the grey base coat showing through. Next up is painting in these brass buckles. To go with the Arcane style, all the metal really called for brush painted non-metallic metal. We delved into this a bit better over on our Patreon using Emma Frost's gold belt for the full tutorial, but let's talk about it a little bit here. He started with a darker base, building up the colours with each layer. To do this, he kept a variety of colour on his wet palette to mix as per his needs. Here he has burnt umber, raw umber, burnt sienna, Naples yellow and cadmium primrose. The base coat is quite dark, and one of the key elements for convincing metal is to use a high contrast between the darkest and lightest colours to mimic a shiny reflective surface. Coupled with that, the placement of the highlights becomes really important. There's not really one exact formula, but his best suggestion is to go look at reference images to see how light reflects off of metal surfaces and copy that to the best of your ability. It doesn't need to be completely accurate, it just needs to be convincing. It takes a bit of practice before you get your eye in. Moving on to a smaller brush, he paints in some scratches on the belts and some shine on the buckles. As we move on to the other fabric, you can really see the Arcane art style coming to life on the trousers already. He first starts with the fabric tied around her knee, coating with this crimson type colour. This was created with a mix of red oxide, red violet, cadmium red and phthalo blue green. Once painted in, he gets back out his sponge to dab in some highlights. I always find this technique really interesting, and for me it's a real trust the process moment. Sometimes I watch him start it and I think, is this right? Is this going to look too much? But stick with it because it really gives such a cool effect at the end. We're going to hop over to base coating the purple knee patch now and come back to the tied fabric after. He paints in a solid purple using a mix of Dioxazine purple and light Phthalo blue. Then the larger sections are painted in with a lighter layer with more Titan violet mixed in. The small lines on the patch have a deeper purple, keeping straight with careful brush control. Finally, the stitching needs to be painted, for which he uses light orange. Now that fabric tied around her leg has had a chance to dry, we're going to go back and paint in the stripes here. For this, he used the mix still on his palette from the original base coat with a slightly bigger ratio of Phthalo blue-green to give this darker colour, and carefully brush painted in the alternate stripes. Next up, he lined them with Mars Yellow Deep. For his final step on this part, he used a fine layer of a slightly brighter mix to blend out some of that sponge texture and give some colour to the upper highlights. In this section, we're going to cover the other basic aspects of her outfit. First, starting with her boots, which are base coated with the colour you see on the wet palette. This was created with a mix of Liquitex soft body acrylic, phthalo green, yellow shade, and so flat crimson, with a little bit of acrylic medium on the palette ready to help adjust the paint as needed. He paints an all over coat before turning to the sponge to add in some texture to the boot, again helping to achieve this grainy leather texture specifically. After this, he uses the airbrush running through the same mix as is on his wet palette to blend together the brush and sponge application, leaving a smoother finish. He alternates between sponge and airbrush until he's happy with the final outcome. On this leg, her trousers are covering the majority of her boot, so the trouser leg just now needs to be colour matched to the rest of the trousers, like we covered in the previous section. Next up, he uses his size 2 Raphael Kolinsky sable brush, painting the shoelaces using Naphtha Pink. Next, he starts more of the NMM process for her toe caps and all the other metal pieces dangling off of the boot. I'm not going to linger on this too long since we covered it on the belt buckle. Moving on to her arm wraps now, and we're going to start with the purple one. He achieves this colour by mixing phthalo blue-green and red-violet, applying with an opaque coverage. With some Titan violet on the palette to help adjust the purple, the edges of the hand wrap are painted in. Using the various blends on the palette, he goes in and applies the shadows and highlights as needed to define the texture of the wrap. This process is important for these smaller details to help them draw the eye on the finished piece and make even the smallest elements of the model pop. It always amazes me how much care he puts into even the tiniest details. He really takes the time to place highlights and shadows in all of the right places to make it clear to the eye that this is layers of fabric wrapped around her arm. This next hand wrap is very similar to the fabric wrapped around her knee, so rather than talk through all of this again, I'm going to just let you enjoy a moment of carefully placed brush strokes. I'm going to gloss over this as well a bit because it's more of the previously talked about NMM knowledge to do this handle of the gun. For her top, Park used Titan Buff and a small addition of the existing mix on his palette where he had used Payne's Grey and Light Orange to achieve this really pale grey and painted a full coverage on her top. Parker then moves to a smaller brush to start building up the highlights. This top is like a bandage wrap around her, so there is a lot of overlapping material and in turn a lot of creases that now need appropriate shadows and highlights. Now we get to some freehand. Parker starts by marking out her cloud tattoos, following the references as best as he could without having a 360 model in front of him. He has both light phthalo blue and cobalt blue on his wet palette. The main filled-in section uses the light phthalo blue, but has a pretty big mix of the cobalt blue for outlining the clouds. There's not really any special secrets to achieving neat freehand, just regular practice is going to be a huge help. Another key thing is making sure you have a good brush that holds a point well. This is why Parker really likes his Raphael Kolinsky sable brushes, and he makes sure to take good care of them so that they always hold a good point. Making sure you have a good hold of the piece and are able to orientate it easily to reach all the areas is also useful. This piece, since it's 1/4 scale, he could get a good enough grip just holding it with his hand. Sometimes you might see him on streams using his cork holders to brace the piece against the desk, helping to stabilise it. If you are interested in those, we have just recently released the STL over on our website. Finally, keep a reference photo to hand so that you don't get lost copying these sorts of patterns. Now things get a bit scary as it's time to paint random markings all over the lovely paint job you've been working on. To achieve these bright colours, Parker used the fluorescent colours from the Gold and So Flat range. In this stage, he puts to use the fluorescent yellow, green, purple and pink to paint in these markings across the model. It's surprisingly tough to paint markings in correct placement and find the right balance between them looking random and imperfect, but also perfect. The fluorescent paints also don't have a great coverage by themselves, so Parker paired them with a similar colour from the normal So Flat range to make a base coat with better coverage. He used a higher proportion of the fluorescent to line over the top of the base coat. You can see here in these final steps how this, coupled with a layer mixed with white, creates this lined look to the final markings. We're starting to get to the final stages now, and I'm going to talk you through her hair and hood. This model had an option for hood up or hood down, and often you may have seen us make swappable heads, but for this model it would have required a full second painted torso, so a decision had to be made and our customer opted for hood up, so we only have some front pieces of the hair to paint. He paints the sections of her hair in varied blues, as well as a pink strip and a purple strip. At this point of painting, Parker's wet palette is pretty well stocked, and he often just utilises what's already there for some stages of his painting, so it's a little tough to pinpoint exactly what colours went into this hair, but it will be some phthalo blue and cobalt blue for the main base, then quinacridone magenta and dioxazine violet and cobalt teal for these coloured streaks. This is all part of the fun of mixing your own colours really. The deeper you get into the project, the more you can just start mixing your mixes and keep on creating new colours and shades to use in your project. Parker likes to call this vibes painting. Often he gets a bit lost in his painting and we lose track of exactly all of the colours that have gone into parts of his project. Moving on to the hood, and Parker starts with an all over coverage of purple, for which he used dioxazine purple mixed in with some cobalt blue. This colour actually came out a bit richer than he tended, so we'll see him tone it down in a bit, but this is a good time to remind you that it's okay to not get things perfect the first time. We can always adjust to meet your desired outcome. This brush shape is also really great for painting up to the edge of her hood detailing and allowing a bit of a wider coverage to speed up this process. To prepare his sponge, he had a bigger addition of the blue this time, and the light phthalo blue helps to knock down the purple tones that he wasn't so happy with at the beginning. He began dabbing in all over to get this varied texturing, which I think really helps make the piece look like fabric. As always, he varies up the paint shade a bit, and with a further addition of light phthalo blue, he achieves this lighter sponged on texture on the top creased sections. He carefully brush paints the edge of the raised pieces in a slightly darker purple before turning to the airbrush to blend all this work together. Parker grabs his brush again to paint the raised markings on each side of the hood. He mixed his own pink from some colours on the wet palette, and the teal side used cobalt teal. He opts for a smaller brush to mark in the highlights in a slightly lightened shade of the colours used for each side. For the teeth of her hood, he uses cobalt teal, light orange and white to make this light bluey grey colour, and fully paints in each section. Each tooth undergoes the same process we've been repeating throughout this video, of highlighting, blending out and using a fine brush to paint on these scratches. The final details on this hood are the stitching, both the small stitches around the edge of each tooth and the large stitches used in various places across the piece. First base coating with Payne's Grey, and then carefully painting in with a pink mix from his existing wet palette colours. So there's been an awful lot of work on this model with so many details covered, but we are in the last step of Jinx herself, and the final base chapter is going to be the quickest part we cover. This design of Jinx has her eyebrows and lashes sculpted, so they just need some careful brush painting, for which Parker used Payne's Grey. Then he paints in the whites of her eyes using a slightly off-white colour. Titanium white with a super tiny amount of pink mixed in worked great. For the lips, Parker uses Goth Skin dipping ink from Green Stuff World. The lips require some patience, a steady hand and some subtlety. He uses extremely diluted layers to glaze the colour on. It's important to use light transparent layers to build up the darker areas and leave the lighter areas with less coverage to keep some of the base coat visible. He also uses this dipping ink to shade some of the skin details like her ear cartilage and nostrils. For those distinctively pink eyes, Parker had quinacridone magenta, dioxazine purple and titanium white on his wet palette. I'm going to switch between the POV and top-down camera for this eye painting so you can see slightly different angles of how he achieves these neatly brush painted eyes. The main colour uses quinacridone magenta, with the purple helping to outline the irises towards the end. Similar to the freehand we covered earlier, the best advice for good eyes is to keep on practicing. You'll soon notice that the eyes get better with each model you paint. Also, this is a 1/4 scale, so maybe have some 1/4 scale heads to start practicing on before moving down to smaller scales. Parker paints everything from 28mm to 450mm, so he's gotten pretty good at eyes in this scale. Also, don't forget to have some variation to the eye colour. This is obviously based on an animation, so there's not as varied shades of pink here compared to how a human eye would actually look. Once the iris is complete, he goes in to paint the pupil with So Flat Black. Finally, what really makes Arcane eyes recognisable is the white light reflections. With the eyes painted in, it's time to grab the pastels to get that smoky eye look Jinx has. Parker first brushes on before using a sponge to smudge in and wipe away the powdery parts, leaving the pigment on the piece. Finishing touch to add to her face is the pink paint across her cheeks, and we are done. It's almost a shame to obscure this lovely face so much, but we must now partially hide it behind her long fringe and hood. With the final part of Jinx herself done, we have just one last thing to cover. We're not going to delve into the base painting too much. This base was created using all of the same techniques you've seen throughout this video, and the final result was achieved with a base coat, sponge work and airbrushing. But let me fill you in on his colour choices at least. For this dark green colour you see, Parker used Payne's Grey and Phthalo Green Blue mix. For the brass sections he's brush painting now, he used raw umber and burnt sienna. Finally, of course, using the sponge to get these edge textures on the piece. At this stage he had added some Mars yellow too. And here is the final model. I know you may say I'm biased, but Parker really has continuously outdone himself this year. We've been able to do less batch painting this year, and it's really let him put his all into some of the work completed. I think that really shows through in this piece. Thank you all so much for watching. Please drop a comment if you enjoyed this video, and maybe join us in Discord if you'd like to discuss more in depth. A big thank you to all of our patrons on screen. We would not be able to make these videos without your support. We will catch you all in the next one.